In 1945, Allied intelligence officers stood at the entrance to Berlin's underground tunnel network with a problem. They had just discovered something that would change everything they thought they knew about the war. But within hours, the decision was made: the public could never know the full truth. For nearly 80 years, governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain kept secrets about what really lay beneath Berlin. They knew things they never told their citizens. They found things they never reported. They covered up truths that would have shocked the world. Welcome back. If you're here for sanitized history, you're in the wrong place. Today, we're exposing the lies, omissions, and deliberate cover-ups about Berlin's underground WW2 tunnel network. This isn't the story they taught you in school. This is about what the Nazi leadership knew but hid from their own people. What the Allies discovered but classified for decades. What the Soviets found and never revealed. And what modern researchers are only now uncovering, information that powerful institutions still don't want you to know. We're going to answer the questions that have been buried for generations. Why did the Nazi government lie to civilians about the tunnel's true purpose? What did Allied intelligence know about the underground network before the war ended? Why did the Soviets seal certain sections and forbid all access for 45 years? What have archaeologists found that contradicts the official historical record? And most importantly, what are they still hiding? By the end of this investigation, you'll understand that the official history of Berlin's tunnels is just the surface layer. The real story has been classified, redacted, and buried, literally and figuratively. Let's dig up the truth they didn't want you to find. Let's start with the Nazi regime itself. What did they know, and what did they tell the German public? The official narrative was straightforward. Berlin's expanded underground network was for civil defense. Shelters to protect civilians from Allied bombing. A humanitarian infrastructure project. The Reich caring for its people. That was a lie. Declassified construction documents, recently made public by the German Federal Archives, reveal the truth. As early as 1934, 5 years before the war even started, Hitler's government began planning an extensive underground military infrastructure. These weren't just bomb shelters. They were command bunkers, communication centers, weapons storage facilities, and escape routes for the Nazi elite. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. The Nazi government deliberately misled the civilian population about the capacity and purpose of the public shelters. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels announced in 1942 that Berlin's bunker system could shelter all residents who need protection. Documents obtained from the Berlin Municipal Archives in 2003 prove this was categorically false. The actual capacity was approximately 500,000 people, in a city of over 4 million. That means nearly 90% of Berlin's population had no access to proper shelter, but the government told them they were protected. Why lie? Because acknowledging the truth would have caused panic and undermined the regime's image of invincibility. The Nazi leadership knew that eventually, the war would come to Berlin. They built elaborate underground facilities for themselves while feeding civilians false assurances. Former Reichsbank employee Erich Schneider, in testimony recorded by the Allies in 1946 but only declassified in 1998, described how civilian construction workers were deliberately compartmentalized. Each crew worked on isolated sections and had no idea of the network's full extent. Workers who asked too many questions disappeared, transferred to other projects or, in some cases, sent to concentration camps for security violations. The deeper, more luxurious bunkers reserved for Nazi officials were disguised in planning documents as administrative archives or storage facilities. Even many government employees didn't know they existed. One of the most significant revelations came from Traudl Junge, Hitler's personal secretary, who survived the war and gave extensive interviews before her death in 2002. She described discovering entire levels of the Führer bunker complex that she hadn't known existed, despite working there daily. "We thought we knew the bunker," she said. Then one day, a door I'd walked past hundreds of times was open. Behind it were stairs going down to another level. When I asked about it, I was told never to speak of it again. What was on those lower levels? We still don't know for certain, but declassified Soviet reports suggest they found interrogation rooms, holding cells, and evidence of executions. The Nazi leadership had built a secret prison beneath their own headquarters, and kept it hidden even from most of their own staff. The regime also lied about forced labor. Publicly, they claimed the tunnels were built by German construction companies employing German workers. The reality, documented in Speer Ministry files discovered in 1985, was that over 70% of the labor force consisted of concentration camp prisoners, prisoners of war, and forced laborers from occupied territories. These workers operated in horrific conditions. Many were literally worked to death. When they died, their bodies were often buried in the tunnel walls themselves, sealed in the concrete as it was poured. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys have detected anomalies consistent with human remains in multiple tunnel walls. The official death toll was never recorded because, to the Nazi regime, these people didn't matter enough to count. There's also evidence the Nazis lied about the timeline. They claimed most construction occurred after 1940, as a response to Allied bombing. But architectural analysis and recently discovered planning documents prove that major construction began in 1936, before the war, before the bombing, when Hitler was still publicly claiming to want peace. This reveals premeditation. The Nazi leadership knew they were planning for total war years before it started. They knew Berlin would eventually come under attack. And they built their underground fortress while telling the German people that war could be avoided through diplomacy. Perhaps the most cynical deception involved the public bunkers. The regime announced that bunker access would be first come, first served during air raids. But declassified police reports from 1943 to 1945 reveal a different reality. Nazi party members and their families received priority access passes. Government employees got preferential treatment. Connected citizens could bribe their way to safety. The poorest Berliners, those who most needed protection, were systematically excluded. When bunkers filled to capacity, guards, often SS or Gestapo officers, would close the doors, leaving thousands on the surface to die. This wasn't incompetence or unfortunate logistics. It was policy, documented in internal memos that have only recently come to light. One memo, dated February 1945 and signed by an SS Gruppenführer whose name remains redacted, explicitly states, "Priority for bunker access shall be given to those whose survival benefits the Reich." Resource allocation to non-essential civilians represents an inefficient use of protective capacity. Translation: let them die. We're saving the bunkers for people who matter. The civilian population wasn't told any of this. They were told they were protected. They were told their government cared for them. They were told the bunkers were safe havens for all. Every single statement was a calculated lie. Now let's talk about what the Allies knew, and this is where things get really interesting. The standard historical narrative says that Allied forces were surprised by the extent of Berlin's underground network when they entered the city in 1945. According to this version, they had no idea about the tunnel system until they captured it. That's not true. Declassified British intelligence files released in 2017 under the UK's 75-year rule reveal that MI6 had detailed information about Berlin's underground construction as early as 1938. German engineers recruited as informants, anti-Nazi resistance members, and even aerial reconnaissance had provided the British with substantial intelligence about what was being built beneath Berlin. A report dated March 1938, classified Most Secret, and only recently made public, describes extensive underground construction in the government district, tunnel connections between major ministry buildings, deep shelters of unusual specifications suggesting military purpose, construction teams working 24-hour shifts. So the British knew. 7 years before the war ended, they knew. American intelligence had similar information. The OSS, Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA, maintained files on Berlin's underground network, including reports from German defectors and resistance contacts. A particularly detailed report from 1943, obtained through Swedish intermediaries, included hand-drawn maps of tunnel routes, bunker locations, and even estimates of the depth and capacity of various facilities. The question becomes, what did they do with this information? The answer is troubling. Very little. Despite knowing about the underground command infrastructure, Allied bombing campaigns rarely targeted the specific locations of bunker entrances or ventilation systems. Why not? The official explanation is that precision bombing was difficult and that broader area bombing was more effective for disrupting German industry and morale. But declassified strategic bombing assessments suggest another factor. Allied command believed that leaving the Nazi leadership in their bunkers actually benefited the Allied war effort. As long as Hitler and his generals were isolated underground, increasingly disconnected from reality, they would make poor strategic decisions. Destroying the bunkers might force them to relocate or decentralize, potentially making German resistance more effective. In other words, the Allies knew about the bunkers and chose not to destroy them because they wanted Hitler to stay there, making increasingly insane decisions. There's also evidence that Allied intelligence specifically wanted to capture the tunnel network intact. The technical intelligence value was enormous: communications equipment, cryptographic materials, military planning documents, scientific research. If the bombing destroyed everything, that intelligence would be lost. But here's where the cover-up begins. After the war, when the public asked why Berlin's command infrastructure hadn't been destroyed, Allied governments claimed they simply didn't know about it. This protected them from questions about why they hadn't done more to end the war faster. The lie served multiple purposes. It made the Nazi regime seem more secretive and sinister, which helped with denazification messaging. It excused Allied strategic decisions that might otherwise have been questioned. And it concealed intelligence sources and methods that they wanted to keep secret for the emerging Cold War. Some of the most explosive revelations involve what the Allies found when they did enter the tunnels, and what they chose not to report. British and American troops entered western sectors of Berlin in July 1945, following the Soviet capture of the city in May. Intelligence teams immediately began exploring the tunnel network. Their reports, many still partially redacted even today, describe discoveries that were never announced to the public. One report, from a U.S. Army intelligence team, describes finding a tunnel section filled with filing cabinets containing detailed records of Nazi human experimentation. The report notes, materials secured for technical intelligence evaluation. Public disclosure not recommended at this time. Not recommended at this time. When was it recommended? Decades later, if at all. Many of these documents weren't released until the 1980s and 1990s, when most of the perpetrators were already dead and couldn't face justice. Another suppressed discovery involved gold and valuables. Allied intelligence teams found multiple caches of stolen property in the tunnel network: gold bullion, currency, jewelry, art objects. Official reports acknowledge some discoveries, but testimony from soldiers involved suggests the publicly reported amounts were significantly lower than what was actually found. Where did the difference go? Some was certainly stolen by individual soldiers. But larger quantities disappeared into official channels and were never properly accounted for. Classified memos reference strategic assets secured for intelligence purposes and materials transferred to theater command for evaluation and disposition. Translation: finders keepers, and we're not telling the public. Perhaps most disturbing is evidence that Allied authorities found, and then covered up, information about the escape routes used by Nazi war criminals to flee Berlin. We know that many high-ranking Nazis escaped Germany after the war, fleeing to South America, the Middle East, and elsewhere. The standard explanation is that they used various routes through Austria, Italy, and ports like Genoa, the so-called Ratlands. But declassified documents suggest that Allied intelligence knew some of these escape routes originated in Berlin's tunnel network, with passages extending beyond the city limits or connecting to rail lines and airfields. They knew about these routes while they were still being used, and they didn't seal them. Why not? Some historians argue incompetence or the chaos of the immediate post-war period. But more cynical interpretations suggest that intelligence agencies deliberately allowed certain Nazis to escape because they might be useful in the coming Cold War. Scientists, intelligence officers, specialists in Soviet affairs, these people had value. A 1947 CIA memo, heavily redacted but partially readable, discusses former German intelligence assets and potential recruitment opportunities. It explicitly mentions individuals who exfiltrated from Berlin through channels established during the final phase of European operations. They knew. They let them go. And they never told the public. The most significant Allied cover-up involved the extent of Soviet discoveries in the tunnels, and how much the Western Allies knew about what the Soviets found. Because the Soviets captured Berlin first, they had unrestricted access to the tunnel network for 2 months before Western Allied forces arrived in the city. In that time, they systematically looted anything of intelligence value. When British and American teams finally got access, the most sensitive areas had already been stripped. Officially, Western Allied governments claimed they had no idea what the Soviets had taken. But declassified intelligence assessments prove they had informants inside the Soviet occupation force who reported on Soviet tunnel operations in near real time. They knew what was being removed, where it was going, and what it meant. They just decided not to tell anyone, because revealing that information would have exposed their intelligence networks inside the Soviet military, sources they wanted to preserve for the developing Cold War. So the pattern becomes clear: the Allies knew far more than they admitted. They found things they never reported. They made strategic decisions to conceal information for intelligence, political, and propaganda purposes. And they've been slowly, reluctantly declassifying the truth ever since. Always decades behind, always claiming they're being transparent while still holding back the most sensitive materials. If the Western Allies kept secrets, the Soviets buried them in concrete. When the Red Army captured Berlin in May 1945, they seized complete control of the underground tunnel network. For 2 critical months before the Western Allies arrived, and then throughout the Cold War in their sector, the Soviets had exclusive access to vast portions of the system. What they found, what they removed, and what they're still hiding represents one of the largest information black holes in modern history. Let's start with the immediate aftermath. Soviet intelligence units, including NKVD and SMERSH, death to spies specialists, descended into the tunnels with explicit orders to find documents, technology, valuables, and personnel. Their focus was systematic and thorough. Declassified Soviet military reports, released after the fall of the USSR in very limited quantities, describe the scale of the operation. Over 2,000 NKVD personnel worked in the Berlin tunnel network during May and June 1945. They removed an estimated 1,500 tons of documents, unknown quantities of gold and valuable scientific equipment and research materials, cryptographic equipment, and code books, communications technology, and over 200 German specialists who were forcibly relocated to the USSR. But these official reports are almost certainly incomplete. Soviet defectors and later Russian historians have suggested the actual haul was far larger and included items never officially acknowledged. One of the biggest mysteries involves Hitler's personal files. We know Hitler maintained extensive records, correspondence, strategic planning documents, intelligence assessments, personal notes. When Soviet forces captured the Reich Chancellery and Führer bunker complex, these files should have been there. They weren't. The filing cabinets were empty. Did Hitler destroy them in his final days? Possibly. But multiple witnesses, including Soviet officers who were there, reported that many filing cabinets were full when first discovered, and then were emptied by NKVD teams who removed the contents to Moscow. What was in those files? We may never know. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but the Russian Federal Security Service, FSB, still maintains classified archives from the NKVD. Requests to access materials related to Hitler's captured documents are routinely denied on grounds of state security. What could possibly still threaten Russian state security 80 years later? The speculation ranges from embarrassing diplomatic correspondence to evidence of cooperation between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union beyond the known Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Soviets also made some discoveries they partially revealed, but with critical details omitted. Take Hitler's death. The Soviets found what they claimed were Hitler's remains, conducted autopsies, and confirmed his identity. But Stalin refused to publicly announce Hitler's death for years, repeatedly suggesting he might have escaped. Why the deception? Declassified Soviet documents reveal the truth. Stalin wanted to keep Western allies uncertain and paranoid, suspecting they might be hiding Hitler. It was a psychological operation, pure and simple. The Soviets knew Hitler was dead, but found it politically useful to pretend they didn't. But there's another layer. The Soviet autopsy reports on Hitler's remains weren't fully released until 1968, and even then with redactions. The complete, unredacted reports weren't made public until 2000, 55 years after the event. What did they hide for so long? According to Russian researchers who finally accessed the complete files, the redacted sections described evidence that Hitler had been poisoned in addition to shooting himself, suggesting someone else may have been involved in ensuring his death. This detail was suppressed because it complicated the simple narrative of Hitler's suicide and raised questions the Soviets didn't want investigated. One of the most tightly held Soviet secrets involved what they found in the deep levels of the tunnel network. Specifically, evidence of Nazi experiments and atrocities. Multiple Soviet reports reference discovering special facilities and experimental apparatus in sealed tunnel sections. The details are vague, but references to medical equipment, detention cells, and disposal systems suggest they found evidence of human experimentation or execution facilities. Why didn't the Soviets publicize these discoveries? At the Nuremberg trials, such evidence would have been valuable for prosecuting Nazi leaders. The answer appears to be that the Soviets wanted to study the equipment and techniques themselves. Just like the Americans and British who recruited Nazi scientists for their own programs, Operation Paperclip, the Soviets seized whatever research they found useful, and didn't want to reveal what they'd taken. A particularly disturbing line appears in a 1947 NKVD report, discussing application of German research methodologies to current operational requirements. It doesn't take much imagination to understand what that means. The Soviets also discovered extensive information about Nazi intelligence networks in the Soviet Union, spy rings, informants, collaborators. Rather than publicizing this, which would reveal the extent of German penetration of Soviet society, they quietly used the information to identify and liquidate the networks. Thousands of people were arrested, imprisoned, or executed based on evidence found in Berlin's tunnels, evidence the Soviets never officially acknowledged existed. When Germany was divided and Berlin became a split city, the tunnel network was divided with it. The Soviets controlled tunnels under East Berlin and systematically sealed, destroyed, or repurposed them. Unlike West Berlin, where some sections were maintained or converted to civil defense shelters, East German authorities, under Soviet supervision, treated the tunnel network as a security threat. Between 1945 and 1961, dozens of successful escapes from East to West Berlin occurred through the old tunnel network. The East German government, paranoid about these escape routes, launched Operation Underground in 1962, a systematic program to seal, flood, or destroy all accessible tunnel sections that might cross sector boundaries. Declassified Stasi, East German secret police, documents describe the operation's extent. Over 50 kilometers of tunnel deliberately collapsed, multiple sections flooded with concrete entrance points bricked up, and hidden tunnel maps classified as state secrets. Anyone caught with tunnel network information imprisoned for espionage. This wasn't just about preventing escapes. It was about controlling information. The East German government didn't want its citizens to know how extensively the Nazi regime had built underground, because it raised uncomfortable questions about how the current government was using the same infrastructure for surveillance and control. Because here's the secret within the secret, the East German government didn't destroy all the tunnels. They kept significant sections operational for their own use. Stasi headquarters in East Berlin connected to the tunnel network. Secret police could move through the city underground, conducting surveillance operations, accessing wiretapping facilities, and maintaining hidden detention centers. After reunification, researchers discovered that Stasi had maintained and expanded portions of the tunnel system, all while officially claiming these tunnels had been destroyed or sealed. The Soviets did the same. KGB operations in East Berlin utilized the tunnel network extensively. When the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet occupation ended, Russian forces removed or destroyed equipment before leaving. But former KGB officers have admitted in interviews that they maintained covert facilities in Berlin's tunnels throughout the Cold War, facilities that officially didn't exist. One of the most significant revelations about Soviet tunnel secrets came in 1999, when a former Soviet military engineer named Dmitry Volkov published his memoirs in Russia. Volkov had worked on tunnel operations in Berlin from 1953 to 1958 and described discovering a section that appeared to predate even the Nazi construction. According to Volkov, his team found a tunnel section built with construction techniques and materials from the early 20th century, or even late 19th century. The tunnel was on maps from the Nazi era but wasn't built by the Nazis. It suggested that Berlin's underground network had layers that went back further than anyone realized. Volkov reported his discovery to his superiors, who ordered him to seal the section and never speak of it. Why? His theory: because it contradicted the official Soviet narrative that the tunnels were purely a Nazi military project. If tunnels existed before the Nazis, it complicated the propaganda message. Volkov's memoir was largely ignored in the West, dismissed as unreliable. But in 2003, construction crews in eastern Berlin accidentally broke through into a tunnel section matching his description. The Berlin City Archives confirmed it was built around 1910, predating Nazi involvement by decades. How many other discovered secrets are still buried in Russian archives? We may never know. Despite the Soviet Union's collapse, Russia's intelligence services maintained strict control over historical documents. Researchers requesting access to Berlin-related files from the NKVD/KGB archives face denials, excessive redactions, or claims that materials have been lost. The message is clear: some secrets, even 80 years old, remain too sensitive to reveal. The tunnel network story didn't end in 1945. Throughout the Cold War, Berlin's underground became a battleground for espionage, operations that all sides kept secret from the public. The most famous is Operation Gold, also known as the Berlin Tunnel. In 1954 to 1955, American and British intelligence agencies dug a tunnel from West Berlin into East Berlin to tap Soviet military communication cables. The operation was compromised from the start. Soviet spy George Blake had informed the KGB before digging even began, but the Soviets let it run for nearly a year to protect Blake's cover. That's the declassified story. But recently released documents suggest Operation Gold was just one visible operation among dozens that remained secret. A 2005 release of CIA documents revealed that the Americans operated at least 7 other tunnel-based intelligence collection operations in Berlin during the Cold War. Some involved tapping communications, others were for covert movement of agents, and still others were for technical surveillance of East German and Soviet facilities. None of these operations were publicly acknowledged until decades after they ended. Why the secrecy, even after the Cold War? Because they involved techniques and technologies the intelligence community still uses. The British operated their own tunnel-based intelligence operations, some jointly with Americans and others independently. MI6 documents declassified in 2015 describe a particularly audacious operation in which British operatives accessed old Nazi-era tunnel sections that connected to the East German Ministry of State Security, Stasi, headquarters. The operation, cryptically named Operation Stopwatch, involved installing listening devices in ventilation shafts and cable conduits accessible through the old tunnel network. The British listened to Stasi conversations for over 3 years before the devices were discovered. The operation's existence was never publicly revealed during the Cold War. Even when the devices were found, the East Germans couldn't publicly admit British intelligence had accessed their headquarters building through tunnels they claimed not to exist. The Soviets and East Germans ran their own operations. Declassified Stasi files reveal multiple attempts to dig tunnels from East to West Berlin, not for escape but for espionage. These operations were generally less successful than Western efforts, but they demonstrate that tunnel-based intelligence collection was a priority for both sides. What the public wasn't told, and what many people still don't realize, is the extent to which the old WW2 tunnel network was mapped, studied, and utilized by Cold War intelligence agencies. Both NATO and Warsaw Pact intelligence services maintained classified databases of tunnel locations, including sections the other side might not know about. These were strategic assets, potential exfiltration routes, dead drop locations, covert observation posts, and more. A fascinating detail emerged in a 1998 CIA historical review. The agency maintained a Berlin underground asset database that cataloged every tunnel, bunker, and underground facility in the city, including detailed structural assessments, access points, and potential intelligence applications. This database was updated continuously from 1945 until at least 1989. The database's existence was classified for over 50 years. Why? Because acknowledging it would reveal the extent of American intelligence operations and capabilities in Berlin. Even allies weren't supposed to know how thoroughly the Americans had mapped the underground. The British, French, and Soviets maintained similar databases. Each side knew tunnels existed but couldn't be sure what the other sides knew. This created a bizarre situation where intelligence operatives from multiple countries were literally walking past each other in the tunnels, each thinking their operations were secret. Some tunnel operations ended in violence. Declassified reports describe at least 3 incidents during the Cold War where intelligence operatives from opposing sides encountered each other in the tunnels. These confrontations, essentially gunfights beneath Berlin streets, were never reported publicly. Bodies were removed, the incidents were classified, and officially, they never happened. One particularly dramatic incident occurred in 1971, described in a CIA report declassified in 2001. American intelligence operatives encountered Soviet agents in a tunnel section beneath the border zone. A brief firefight erupted. One Soviet agent was killed, 2 Americans wounded. Both sides quietly retrieved their personnel and sealed the tunnel section. Neither government ever acknowledged the incident. Why the absolute secrecy? Because admitting to armed confrontations beneath Berlin could have escalated into major diplomatic incidents or even military confrontation. Both sides calculated that keeping these encounters secret served everyone's interest, except perhaps the public's right to know. The tunnel network also facilitated espionage operations we're only now learning about. In 2010, former CIA officer Robert Wallace published a memoir describing how American intelligence used old WW2 bunkers as covert meeting sites for recruiting and handling Soviet defectors. One bunker, location still classified, was maintained in absolute secrecy as a CIA safehouse from 1954 to 1989. East German or Soviet citizens who wanted to defect or provide information would be covertly guided to the bunker through the tunnel network, debriefed by American handlers, and either exfiltrated to the west or returned to East Berlin to continue spying. The bunker's existence was so closely held that even most CIA officers in Berlin didn't know about it. Wallace estimates that over 35 years, more than 200 intelligence operations were run through that single location, and the East Germans never discovered it. How many other such facilities existed? We don't know. Wallace's memoir hints at multiple sites, plural, but doesn't provide details. The CIA's official response to questions about these revelations has been no comment, neither confirming nor denying, which is itself telling. The most sensitive tunnel-related operations involved weapons and sabotage. Declassified documents reveal that both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces cached weapons, explosives, and equipment in tunnel sections during the Cold War. The Western Allies prepared stay-behind networks, covert operatives and cached weapons who would conduct guerrilla warfare if the Soviets invaded West Berlin. Some of these weapons caches were placed in tunnel sections that would be accessible even if the surface was occupied. Similarly, Soviet forces prepared sabotage equipment in tunnels beneath West Berlin, accessible through sections that crossed sector boundaries underground. If war came, Soviet special forces could emerge from these tunnels to attack critical infrastructure. After reunification, some of these weapons caches were discovered by construction crews or urban explorers. Each discovery was treated as a serious security incident. Bomb disposal teams were called in. The areas were cordoned off. And then official statements would claim the weapons were lost or forgotten. But internal security assessments, later leaked to journalists, reveal the truth. These weren't lost or forgotten. They were part of deliberate Cold War contingency planning that both sides conducted and both sides kept secret from the civilian population. Imagine living in Berlin during the Cold War, not knowing that beneath your feet were cached weapons, prepared for a war that thankfully never came. Imagine discovering that intelligence operatives from multiple countries were conducting covert operations in tunnels you didn't know existed, sometimes resulting in violence that was never reported. That was the reality, hidden, classified, and denied. You'd think that after German reunification in 1990, all the secrets would come out. The Cold War was over. Germany was unified and democratic. Archives would open. Truth would emerge. You'd be wrong. Modern researchers exploring Berlin's tunnel network face a frustrating reality. They find things they're not allowed to publish. They discover information that gets classified retroactively. They encounter resistance from government agencies that shouldn't have anything left to hide. The Berlin Underworlds Association, Berliner Unterwelten, the primary organization exploring and preserving the tunnel network, has documented over 300 bunkers and tunnel sections since their founding in 1997. They've published books, created museum exhibits, and conducted tours. But in multiple interviews, association members have acknowledged there are discoveries they can't discuss. Sites they've explored but can't reveal. Information they've found but are prohibited from sharing. Why? Who's stopping them? And what are they hiding? The restrictions come from multiple sources. Some are straightforward: active infrastructure, subway systems, utility tunnels, obviously can't be fully disclosed for security reasons. Structural safety concerns justify restricting information about unstable sections. But other restrictions are harder to justify. In 2004, a research team from the Berliner Unterwelten discovered a previously unknown bunker complex beneath the former Reich Security main office site. The complex included rooms that appeared to have been used as detention cells, complete with chains anchored to walls and evidence of fires. The researchers documented everything, took samples for forensic analysis, and prepared to publish their findings. Then they received a letter from the German Federal Ministry of the Interior. The letter, later leaked to the press, strongly advised them not to publish specific details about the site, including its exact location, on grounds of preservation of public order and respect for victims. The stated justification was preventing the site from becoming a neo-Nazi pilgrimage location. That's a reasonable concern. But critics pointed out that the ministry's letter also prohibited publication of forensic analysis results and documentary evidence found at the site. What did they find that went beyond location concerns? The researchers are legally prohibited from saying, and that prohibition remains in effect today. Similar incidents have occurred multiple times. In 2009, researchers found a sealed room containing what appeared to be medical equipment from the 1940s. When they reported the discovery to authorities, the room was immediately sealed by order of the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, Germany's domestic intelligence agency. The stated reason: potential biological hazard. But why would an intelligence agency, rather than a health department, be involved in a biological hazard response? And why, after the room was ventilated and cleared, does the access restriction remain in place? One researcher, speaking anonymously to a German magazine in 2011, suggested the equipment in that room was consistent with human experimentation facilities. If confirmed, it would be evidence of previously undocumented Nazi atrocities. The researcher speculated that the government didn't want it published because it would raise questions about why it took 64 years to discover, and whether other such sites remain undiscovered. The German government's response was to neither confirm nor deny, maintaining only that access restrictions were necessary and appropriate. International researchers face even more obstacles. Foreign archaeologists and historians who want to study Berlin's tunnels must navigate a complex bureaucratic approval process. Applications are frequently denied without detailed explanation. Dr. Sarah Michaels, a British historian who has spent 15 years studying Berlin's WW2 underground infrastructure, described her experience in a 2018 interview. "I've had 3 research proposals rejected. The stated reasons are always vague: insufficient justification, preservation concerns, resource limitations. But colleagues working on less sensitive historical topics get approval easily. It's clear that certain aspects of the tunnel network remain off-limits for reasons that have nothing to do with historical preservation." What might those reasons be? One possibility is ongoing intelligence sensitivity. Remember, these tunnels were used for espionage throughout the Cold War. Some of those operations were run jointly by Allied intelligence agencies, German, American, British, French, that are still operating today. If researchers discovered evidence of Cold War intelligence operations that haven't been officially acknowledged, it could create diplomatic complications or reveal methods and techniques still in use. Better, from the intelligence community's perspective, to keep researchers away from sensitive areas entirely. Another possibility is economic. Berlin is constantly building new buildings, new transit lines, new infrastructure. If researchers published detailed maps and locations of every tunnel and bunker, it would complicate development. Property values might be affected. Construction costs could increase. Developers and city planners have a vested interest in limiting public knowledge of what's beneath their building sites. If a construction project encounters a historically significant bunker, it can cause expensive delays. Better, from a development perspective, if researchers don't publish exactly where those bunkers are. But the darkest possibility is that there are still discoveries waiting to be made that powerful institutions don't want found. Evidence of crimes that were never prosecuted. Proof of collaboration between parties that officially deny any connection. Documentation of post-war cover-ups. Bodies that were never accounted for. Berlin's tunnels are a time capsule from one of history's darkest periods. Not everything in that time capsule reflects well on institutions that still exist today. Some secrets benefit from remaining buried. Consider this. In 2016, construction crews working on a new subway extension broke through into a previously unknown tunnel section. Inside, they found filing cabinets containing documents, personnel records from the Reich Main Security Office. These documents were immediately seized by federal authorities. Researchers requested access under Germany's Freedom of Information laws. The request was denied. The official reason: protection of personal privacy of individuals named in documents. But the individuals in question worked for the Nazi security apparatus 70+ years ago. Most are long dead. Whose privacy, exactly, is being protected? Speculation centers on the possibility that the documents reveal post-war fates of Nazi personnel, perhaps showing that some who escaped justice were protected by or recruited by Allied intelligence agencies. Confirming such arrangements would be embarrassing for multiple governments. So the documents remain classified, access denied, truth concealed. Modern technology has made some discoveries harder to suppress. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR scanning, and other techniques can map underground structures without physical access. Amateur researchers have used these technologies to create unofficial maps of Berlin's tunnel network. Authorities have responded by trying to regulate the technology. In 2013, Berlin's city government proposed regulations that would require licenses to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys, citing security and privacy concerns. Critics noted that these regulations would effectively prevent independent research into the tunnel network. The regulations passed. Now, only licensed and approved researchers can legally conduct underground scans in Berlin, and licenses are rarely granted for tunnel-related research. This isn't unique to Germany. Other countries with sensitive underground infrastructure have similar restrictions. But in Berlin's case, the restrictions apply to historical research about events 75+ years in the past. Why? The pattern becomes clear. Modern authorities, for various reasons, are continuing the tradition of secrecy that began with the Nazis, continued through the Cold War, and persists today. They know what's down there. They know what researchers might find. And they've decided, without public debate or justification, that some truths should remain buried. Let's talk about money. Because one of the biggest secrets buried in Berlin's tunnels is financial, and it involves amounts that would shock you. The Nazis looted Europe on an industrial scale. Gold from occupied national banks. Currency. Jewelry confiscated from Jewish families. Art stolen from museums and private collections. The total value ran into billions, and much of it ended up in Berlin. The official story is that Allied forces recovered most of this stolen wealth after the war and returned it to rightful owners or deposited it in accounts for victim compensation. That's partially true. But it's far from the complete picture. Declassified financial records and investigative journalism have revealed that substantial quantities of Nazi gold and valuables were never officially accounted for. And the trail frequently leads back to Berlin's tunnel network. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, maintained vault facilities in underground bunkers. As the war turned against Germany, gold and currency were transferred from vulnerable locations to Berlin's supposedly secure underground storage. When Soviet forces captured Berlin, they found multiple Reichsbank vault rooms in the tunnel network. Official Soviet reports acknowledge recovering significant quantities of gold and currency. But the amounts were never precisely stated. Western Allied intelligence, analyzing Soviet financial movements after the war, estimated that the USSR had captured approximately 10 tons of gold from Berlin. The Soviets officially declared less than 3 tons. Where did the difference go? Most historians believe it was simply stolen, diverted into Soviet state coffers, never returned to rightful owners, never accounted for. The Soviet Union collapsed without ever providing a full accounting. But the mystery deepens because there's evidence of additional gold that the Soviets never found, caches hidden in tunnel sections they didn't discover or couldn't access. In 1988, construction crews in West Berlin broke through into a sealed bunker room. Inside, they found a steel safe containing approximately 50 kilograms of gold bars, stamped with German Reichsbank markings, plus foreign currency from multiple countries. This discovery was reported and the gold was seized by authorities. But it raised questions. If a cache that size sat undiscovered for 43 years, how many others might still be hidden? Treasure hunters think about this question a lot. Berlin has a persistent community of people searching for hidden Nazi gold. Most are amateurs with metal detectors and fantasies. But some are serious researchers with historical documents and credible theories. German law is clear: anything found belongs to the state, and unauthorized excavation is illegal. But that hasn't stopped people from trying. City authorities regularly discover illegal excavations in abandoned bunker sections, people digging for gold they believe is hidden somewhere in the tunnels. Have any of them found anything? Officially, no. Unofficially, there are rumors of discoveries that were never reported, because admitting you found Nazi gold means the government will seize it, and you'll face prosecution for illegal excavation. One persistent rumor involves a discovery allegedly made in the early 1990s, shortly after reunification, when security was lax and many tunnel sections were unguarded. According to the story, which has circulated in Berlin's underground explorer community for years, a group found multiple gold bars in a flooded tunnel section. Rather than report it, they allegedly smuggled the gold out, dried and cleaned the bars to remove identifying marks, and sold them quietly through intermediaries. The story is impossible to verify, which is exactly what you'd expect if it were true. But there are hints that support it. International gold markets in the early 1990s saw unusual quantities of old gold entering circulation through Eastern European intermediaries. Some of that gold's provenance was questionable. Could some have been Nazi gold from Berlin's tunnels? We'll probably never know for certain. The financial secrets aren't just about gold. They're also about art. The Nazis stole an estimated 650,000 art objects during their occupation of Europe. After the war, Allied forces recovered approximately 200,000 pieces and returned them or placed them in museums. That leaves 450,000 objects unaccounted for. Many were probably destroyed in bombing or fires. Many were stolen by individuals and disappeared into private collections. But research suggests that significant quantities were stored in Berlin's tunnel network and were either looted during the city's capture or remain hidden there. In 2010, German authorities discovered the Gurlitt hoard, over 1,500 artworks worth an estimated $1 billion, hidden in the apartment of an elderly man named Cornelius Gurlitt. His father, Hildebrand Gurlitt, had been one of Hitler's art dealers and had hidden a massive collection of looted art. The discovery raised urgent questions. How much other looted art remains hidden? And crucially, how did Hildebrand Gurlitt get his collection out of Berlin at the end of the war? Researchers investigating the Gurlitt case found evidence that Hildebrand had stored artworks in a tunnel bunker beneath Berlin during the war. He somehow retrieved them during the chaotic final days and evacuation period, then smuggled them out of the city. If Gurlitt successfully retrieved art from the tunnels, others must have done the same. How many bunker rooms that supposedly contained art were actually empty when Allied forces arrived because the contents had already been removed by their owners or by looters? We don't know, because comprehensive inventories of what was stored wherein Berlin's tunnels were either never created, destroyed, or remain classified. There are also financial secrets about what happened after the war. Western Allied forces recovered substantial quantities of gold and valuables from Berlin and other locations. This wealth was supposed to be managed by the Tripartite Gold Commission and returned to countries from which it was stolen. But declassified documents reveal significant discrepancies between what was found and what was officially reported. Allied soldiers looted. Officers diverted valuables to intelligence budgets. Entire shipments of gold went missing in transit. One particularly well-documented case involves the U.S. Army's recovery of gold from a mine in Merkers, Germany, in 1945, not Berlin, but relevant to the pattern. The initial inventory recorded significantly more gold than the final official report acknowledged. Where did the difference go? Congressional investigations in the 1990s uncovered evidence that some was diverted to fund covert intelligence operations. The CIA's predecessor, the OSS, and later the CIA itself, used recovered Nazi assets to finance operations that Congress hadn't authorized or funded. This practice, nicknamed off-books funding, was facilitated by the chaos of the immediate post-war period when proper accounting was difficult. If this happened with gold recovered in Western Germany, it almost certainly happened with assets recovered from Berlin. But the full accounting has never been made public. Modern estimates suggest that Nazi-looted wealth worth $5 to $10 billion, in modern value, remains unaccounted for. The darkest secrets buried in Berlin's tunnels are human. How many people died in those underground passages? How many bodies were never recovered? How many deaths were never investigated? The official accounting is incomplete, contradictory, and almost certainly understated. Let's start with what we know. During the Battle of Berlin in April-May 1945, tens of thousands of civilians sheltered in the tunnel network. When sections were flooded, many drowned. When the battle raged through the tunnels, many were killed in the fighting. When bunkers were sealed or collapsed, many were trapped. The official German death toll from the Battle of Berlin lists approximately 125,000 civilians killed. But this number is based on incomplete records from a chaotic period. It counts bodies that were recovered and identified or deaths that were witnessed and reported. How many people died in the tunnels and were simply never found? We don't know. In the decades since, construction crews and researchers have repeatedly discovered human remains in sealed tunnel sections. Each discovery is documented, the remains are analyzed if possible, and then they're buried in war cemeteries, usually without identification. A partial accounting based on public reports lists at least 200 such discoveries since 1945. But researchers believe the real number is higher because not all discoveries are publicly reported. Why not? Sometimes because the discovery occurs during construction projects that can't afford delays. Sometimes because authorities determine that further investigation isn't warranted. And sometimes, disturbingly, because the circumstances of death raise questions authorities don't want to answer. In 2007, construction crews found a sealed room in a tunnel section beneath the former Gestapo headquarters. Inside were skeletal remains of 14 individuals, all showing signs of execution, bullet wounds to the head. These people were clearly murdered. But who were they? When did they die? Who killed them? Forensic analysis determined death occurred in 1944 or 1945 based on artifacts found with the bodies. The room's location suggested Gestapo involvement. But authorities never publicly identified the victims or opened a formal investigation. Why not? A spokesman stated that, given the passage of time and the historical context, investigation would not serve a prosecutable purpose. Translation: everyone involved is probably dead, so why bother? But critics pointed out that identification would serve a memorial purpose. These victims have families who might want closure. And investigation would serve a historical purpose. documenting Gestapo crimes. The decision not to investigate suggests authorities were more interested in moving on than confronting uncomfortable truths. This isn't an isolated incident. Similar discoveries of execution victims in the tunnels have occurred multiple times, and each time, authorities have done minimal investigation. There's also the question of forced laborers who died during tunnel construction. We know from declassified documents that thousands of concentration camp prisoners, POWs, and forced laborers worked on the tunnels. We know many died from maltreatment, accidents, or deliberate murder. But how many? And where are they buried? Some were probably taken back to concentration camps and disposed of there. But survivor testimonies describe bodies being buried in the tunnels themselves, sometimes simply walled up in construction areas, entombed in concrete. Ground-penetrating radar studies have detected anomalies consistent with human remains in multiple tunnel walls. But authorities have never authorized excavation to confirm this, citing the expense and structural risk of removing concrete. Critics suggest another reason. Germany doesn't want to confirm that bodies were used as construction fill. It's too horrifying, too barbaric. Better to leave them undiscovered. After the war, mass graves from the Battle of Berlin were excavated and the remains reburied properly. But this process was incomplete. Soviet authorities in East Berlin were less thorough than Western authorities. Many mass graves were simply paved over as the city rebuilt. In 2005, construction for a new building discovered a mass grave containing over 200 bodies, civilians and soldiers mixed together. The grave's existence had been known from historical reports, but its exact location had been forgotten. If one known mass grave could be forgotten and paved over, how many unknown graves exist beneath Berlin? How many tunnel sections contain bodies that no one recorded? We'll probably never know the complete answer. There's also a disturbing category of post-war deaths, people who entered the tunnels after 1945 and never emerged. During the early Cold War period, the tunnel network was incompletely secured. Urban explorers, treasure hunters, refugees, and homeless people entered tunnel sections. Some got lost in the maze. Some encountered unstable structures that collapsed. Some were caught in flooded sections. How many people died this way? There's no official count because many of these people were never reported missing. Refugees fleeing between sectors, illegal explorers who told no one where they were going, they just disappeared. In 1987, a West Berlin urban explorer named Klaus Mennert went missing. His friends knew he explored the tunnels regularly. Search teams found his backpack in a tunnel section, but never found him. He's presumed dead, but his body was never recovered. Mennert's case got attention because he had friends who reported him missing and pushed for a search. How many people without such connections simply vanished? The Berlin Underworlds Association estimates that at least 50 people have died in the tunnels since 1945 through accidents or getting lost. They believe the real number could be much higher because of unreported cases. Each time a new tunnel section is opened, there's a possibility of finding remains. Sometimes they do. Most discoveries aren't publicized unless media somehow learns about them. The official position is that publicizing every discovery would be sensationalistic and disrespectful. Critics argue that secrecy is actually disrespectful. These people deserve to be remembered, their deaths acknowledged. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect is the suspected murder victims from the Cold War era. During the division of Berlin, the tunnel network was a dangerous borderland. People who knew too much, spies who became liabilities, defectors who changed their minds, the tunnels were a convenient place for such problems to disappear. There's no documentary evidence of intelligence agencies using the tunnels for assassinations. That's exactly the kind of operation that wouldn't be documented. But former intelligence officers have hinted at it in memoirs and interviews, always vaguely, never with specifics. In 1992, shortly after reunification, construction crews found skeletal remains in a tunnel section near where the border had been. The victim had been shot execution style. Forensic analysis dated death to the 1970s or early 1980s. The victim was never identified. The case was never solved. Police quietly closed it as unsolvable given the time elapsed. Was this person a spy? A defector? A victim of criminal violence? We'll never know. And that's the tragic reality of Berlin's tunnel network. It's not just a historical site. It's a cemetery where thousands rest in unknown graves, their stories untold, their deaths unacknowledged. It's 2024. World War II ended 79 years ago. The Cold War ended 33 years ago. The secrets should all be out by now. They're not. Multiple governments still maintain classified files about Berlin's tunnel network. They still restrict access to certain sections. They still redact documents before releasing them. What could possibly still be sensitive after all this time? Let's start with Germany. The German federal government maintains classifications on tunnel-related documents under several legal authorities. Protection of intelligence sources and methods, protection of privacy, state security interests, preservation of public order. Under German law, intelligence-related documents can remain classified indefinitely if agencies certify ongoing sensitivity. Many Berlin tunnel documents carry this designation. Researchers requesting access typically receive one of several responses. The documents you request do not exist, often provably false. The documents are classified for state security reasons. Documents released with extensive redactions, access denied to protect privacy of individuals mentioned. The fourth reason is particularly frustrating because it's applied to documents about people who died decades ago. Whose privacy is actually being protected? One theory: the privacy being protected is institutional, not individual. The documents might reveal embarrassing information about government agencies' actions or failures, and agencies are using privacy laws as a convenient excuse to avoid disclosure. The United States still classifies Berlin tunnel documents as well. Despite periodic declassification releases, significant gaps remain. The CIA has released documents about Operation Gold and some other Berlin operations. But each release is heavily redacted, and researchers note that entire operational categories appear to be missing from what's been released. For example, documents related to CIA operations in Berlin from 1945 to 1950 are almost entirely absent from declassified releases. The CIA claims most were either destroyed or transferred to other agencies. Researchers are skeptical. Those were crucial years, and the idea that virtually no operational records survived is hard to believe. More likely, those documents remain classified under exemptions for intelligence sources and methods still in use, foreign government information, Germany doesn't want it released, ongoing security interests. In 2018, historian Dr. Richard Brightman filed a FOIA request for CIA documents related to the tunnel network from 1947 to 1952. After a 2-year delay, he received approximately 300 pages, 95% redacted. Entire pages were blacked out except for headers and dates. When Brightman appealed, the CIA's response stated that the redactions protected intelligence sources and methods that remain viable, and information provided by foreign liaison partners who have not consented to disclosure. The first reason is plausible: intelligence agencies do reuse techniques. But the second reason suggests Germany is actively blocking disclosure, even 70+ years later. Why would Germany do that? Possibly because the documents reveal cooperation between post-war German authorities and American intelligence agencies in ways that would be politically embarrassing. Or because they reveal that former Nazis were recruited and protected. Or because they document operations that violated German sovereignty. British intelligence continues to classify Berlin tunnel documents as well. MI6 and GCHQ have released some materials under the UK's 50-year and 75-year declassification rules, but significant redactions remain. The most frustrating aspect is that different countries have pieces of the puzzle, but none wants to release complete information. An operation might have been run jointly by American, British, and German intelligence. Each country has some documents. Each redacts different parts. None will share their complete files.